All right. Okay. So, welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. And the goal was to do this live. And I hope the audience did get the link in the YouTube channel because I'm not sure what happened. I've tested this over and over again, and it says the YouTube is coming up as an error. So, I'm not sure why. And so I shared the link the in YouTube. So hopefully people see it. So Dr. Mance, welcome. Welcome, welcome. Very excited about this episode. I was really excited. I just want to explain one of the reasons I thought of Dr. Mance is every time I think about learning for truth and love and what that means, our mental health state keeps coming in so many ways, in the way we connect with each other, and the way we connect with students, and the way students connect with us, and even when studying and in every single process. And so, Dr. Mance, I want to start with, and just to let you know, Dr. Mance and I, we go way back.
Yes.
It's been a couple of years. We went through the tenure process together and supported each other. It was really an exciting moment, and I remember, we've had these conversations.
Yes.
So that's an mental health process, right? You're just supporting
Right.
each other through the whole process. So I'm really thrilled to have you here. I am going to have you start by talking about yourself, who you are, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, we do go way back. And kind of speaking of stress, we kind of really helped each other through a very, very stressful time. So I'm delighted to be able to speak about mental health, and particularly since we're framing it in regards to like trauma, traumatic experiences and mental health and coping, giving that the time that we're in regards to people really kind of experiencing a lot of different stressors. And for some, those stressors kind of turning into the more traumatic type stressors for them. Um, so, as you stated, my name is GiShawn Mance. I am an associate professor of psychology at Howard University. I am the director of the Youth and Communities Research Group, where we focus on community-based participatory research. And in that participatory research, we partner with local communities to address essentially a prevalent mental health concern for that community. And so a lot of our work has been primarily focusing on trauma-informed community-based interventions. The primary population is what we call emerging adults. So young people between the ages of 18 to 25, really kind of focusing on psychoeducation around mental health, how trauma or experiences of trauma kind of impact mental health or just our day-to-day functioning, how we navigate life. So that is more the research aspect of it. I'm also in private practice in Maryland, and my practice is primarily adolescents and emerging adults, but I do see some adults, but I focus on what we call internalizing symptomology, so more of like anxiety, depression,
Mm.
and I do have training in trauma-informed care,
Mm-hmm.
as well as clinical assessments related to executive functioning, and doing those types of assessments.
Wow.
And most importantly, I have to talk about the family. Most importantly,
Absolutely.
I am a mother, I am a wife, I am a daughter, I am a friend, a neighbor, a community member. I am much more than a psychologist.
Absolutely. Amazing, all those dimensions, right, that we have. I have to say, I've always admired, what you've done, especially, is talking about your clinical lab there as well. And I know that it's something that several communities that I know even here are working on. And even, the church that I now attend, they've been working on that kind of work. Now, I want to think of this, too, in several different ways. So, what is trauma informed, therapy? And I know that you do this in a way that contextualizes it and situates it in our communities. Can you speak a little bit to what you do there and what perspectives you can bring to, general?
Absolutely. It's so layered when we kind of think about the African diaspora and Black Black people's experiences. So when we kind of think about trauma, we can think about when we think about trauma, we can think about trauma in regards to big T, little t. And when I say trauma informed care, is in regards to kind of understanding people's lived experiences and how those lived experiences, if they are experienced as traumatic, how it then may impact how symptoms may present themselves in their day-to-day lives, or how that trauma experience may impact how symptoms manifest or show up through the therapeutic process.
Mm-hmm.
So being very mindful that we have to think about the person's lived experience and traumatic experiences, how trauma may be impacting the brain and
Mm-hmm.
in turn impacting relationships and abilities to form relationships or not form relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So, from a community standpoint, what does that look like for trauma informed from a community? Because it's one thing to kind of talk about from an individual care, but for community, it's more of kind of thinking about it. So, I think when we think about community and trauma, we may automatically think of those more physical aspects or representations of trauma. So, whether it's community violence
Mm-hmm.
or things of that nature, but it can also be layered and systemic, and kind of that systemic experiences as a person of the African diaspora, or Black person in the US, let's be very specific, and those experiences of racism and discrimination accumulated over time can be experienced as traumatic.
Absolutely.
And so we kind of call that more of like that complex trauma, if you will, and the complex because it's ongoing. You don't necessarily get into it per se, and how it may then impact how symptoms may show up for a person given that larger context of stressors that one may be experienced as traumatic events,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the accumulation. It's not just this one experience of discrimination or racism, but it's the accumulation of it over time. And so, what I bring to whether it's individual care or community care is really kind of understanding the symptoms that may show up. So let's say for an example, there may be difficulty concentrating, there may be some irritability, fatigue, lack of disruptive sleep, lack of appetite. So all of those are
Mm-hmm.
symptoms we may see, and those symptoms can be taking us down the path of a number of different areas of concern, of mental health concern, whether it's anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
depression. But the aspect of, because that symptomology can show up because of different kind of concerns, it's helpful to know when there's trauma has impacted or is present. These things may be showing up because it's impacted the brain,
Mm-hmm.
how the brain is able to process information or not process information, how you're able to access what we call the thinking brain, the emotional brain, and whether you kind of hang out in that where your cortisol levels are kind of elevated, where you're kind of hanging out in that fight, flight, or freeze.
Mm-hmm.
And because of those levels of cortisol or those levels of adrenaline tend to be elevated because you kind of tend to hang out there and live there because your lived experience over time has been one in which you've had to have those elevated levels of cortisol and adrenaline. The way that you tend to then respond to your environment may be one that you are have a startled response or be more on alert.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that we're not just looking at these symptoms, but we're looking in the context of how trauma may either complicate the presentation or informed how we understand these other symptoms that could be common symptoms for a number of concerns.
Wow. Wow, I had 1,000 questions, and I was so busy frazzled trying to get us live that I forgot to have my things to write this down. So
Uh,
it's interesting because as I get older and as I figure things out, I've come to see the things we don't consider traumatic are really traumatic, right?
mhm,
And oftentimes it's almost like, from what I observe, trauma begets trauma, right?
mhm,
And sometimes, even when I think about the classroom, we don't realize when something we do is inflicting trauma or not inflicting trauma, or even from the teacher's perspective, right? And I love what you said, but trauma is passed down, right? And that even people who can seem like the nicest people do have traumatic experiences, right? I'll give you an example. One of the things I started realizing is, even being in the same room with someone who, let's just say, is anger, right? Anger is traumatizing to people as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I know oftentimes we have these stereotypes about who's the angry person, but I don't think people realize that sometimes they're traumatized by anger. And I'm so curious about how some of these, what are some things that you've come across that are traumatizing that people didn't realize were traumatizing, in your work and research.
Yeah, I think
No.
that's a great question. And that's where I kind of think about the big T, little t.
Mm-hmm.
And when I kind of thinking about the types of trauma, because when we think about trauma, there's typically, we call it the three E's of trauma. And the three E's, the letter E, there's the event.
Okay.
Because there two people can experience the same event, and one
Mm-hmm.
person can walk away having trauma symptoms or feeling traumatized, and another not. And it could be
Mm-hmm.
essentially the same event, kind of witness the same event, if you will, or experience
Right.
the same event. So there's the event, but then there's the experience of the event. So essentially, how you experienced it, um, whether it's individual, physical, emotionally harmful, or was it life threatening to you? So did you experience it in that way?
Mm-hmm.
But more so, the last part of it, really kind of defining whether it's traumatic, is that lasting adverse effects. So you
Mm-hmm.
got your event, your experience, and then the effects of
Mm-hmm.
that event. And for some people, when we're kind of thinking about the effects, for some people, their ability to be able, their coping and how they're able to kind of appraise the situation. Do I have the coping skills to be able to manage it? Or
Mm-hmm.
if I don't, then now it's a threat. And so then how do I kind of overcome this threat? And if I feel like I can't, it becomes overwhelming. And so
Mm.
the lasting effects that a person may have is essentially, it may impact the effects on their mental, right? So how they
Wow.
show up, how they engage with others. The effect may be mild, it may be more intense or adverse.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of think about that. And so when I think about the big T, there are the big T traumas where we probably all collectively will identify those things as traumatic. So whether it is like a car accident, like a major car accident, a natural disaster, being the experiencing, viewing violence where
Mm-hmm.
someone is fatally harmed, or those are kind of like big T events that we can, and sometimes even the death of a loved one can be like more of like a big T event. And then the little T events may be those things that may be more subjective to you and what you experience, but the effect of them may be more adverse. So for example, for some people, little T meaning the experience is not little, but it's just more the big T where we all collectively can agree upon as traumatic, and the little T. So, for example, for a divorce for one person may be considered traumatic because of the experience, the experience of it, and then the adverse effects
Mm-hmm.
from that experience may be more long term.
Right.
Um, and then for others, like the little T may be whether it's the relationship caring for an aging parent, or for another person, it could be, okay, they're in college, they're in school, but then maybe there's some housing insecurity
Mm-hmm.
or food insecurity, or everything is on their shoulders when it comes to their family, and they're the great hope and they're holding that. So this experience of kind of matriculating through school, where for others maybe, oh, I'm having the best time of my life, the
Mm-hmm.
way that they are experiencing it may be very stressful, and their levels of stress are constantly elevated. And so the effects and the adverse effects of it is that they're mentally kind of feeling down, depressed,
Mm.
kind of isolating themselves. And so this experience, where for others maybe a kind of bringing liberation and freedom of
Mm-hmm.
education, for another can be like, this is, I'm experiencing this almost to the extent of like feeling like a little T,
Wow.
meaning traumatic experience, because the stress becomes more, it's more traumatic stress. The stress level I'm appraising is overwhelming and outside the realm of my ability to be able to manage the stress.
Wow. I love that three E's you said. So first it's effect, experience, and I'm sorry, no, event,
Mm-hmm.
experience,
Experience and
and
then
effect.
effects.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I love that you separated it because, like you said, you can have the same experience and it be traumatic for one and not traumatic for the other. And I'm thinking about a couple situations. Okay. So one situation I'm thinking about is, and so, okay, I'll say, so I have friends from different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities. And I'm thinking right now of, some of my white friends and some of my black friends. One of the things that come up that I observe, and this is things you talk about in both ends, is I'm starting to see some of the traumatic effects of living in a patriarchal society.
Mm.
And some of the trauma that I even see some of my white female friends go through in terms of the way they're treated, and the way they respond to it. But I also see others who are in that same patriarchal zone, and it's not traumatic for them. And the biggest difference observe is in the way they set boundaries for themselves and in the way they are able to. The effect is different and the experience is different because of who they are. Um, and I'm observing, and I'm comparing with some of my other friends who are black and the boundaries they've set. And it's interesting because I don't know. Can you just talk to that? Because I'm just fascinated by, and I know I made it very binary. It's not necessarily that straightforward. But in talking to my female friends from different backgrounds, this is kind of what comes up. It's almost as if, yeah. Can you speak to that in your work?
Yeah. So I want to make sure that I kind of grasping the question in regards to why is it that some may experiencing so where we are now and what we are experiencing it isn't necessarily new, but the weight of this patriarchal society is kind of the weight of it feels different
Mhm.
than it has in the past. And why is it that some people are struggling a bit more than others? Is that where we are? Or are they experiencing it more as traumatic versus others who are not?
And it's not even the idea that some are struggling and some are not. I think that it's a struggle that's always been there for some,
Okay.
for those especially who have chosen not to accept it. But I've also seen, even in having done classes with students who might grow up in a more patriarchal home compared to students who might have grown up in a more matriarchal home, right? For example, I grew up with just my mom, right? So my home was more matriarchal. I've just observed that difference in terms of um, different levels of even freedom of expression, right? That I've observed, and sometimes, and it depends on a relationship. It's not even a matter of patriarchal or matriarchal, because if you're in any relationship that's controlling, what have you come across even in terms of being in controlling relationships? I mean, look, we talk a lot about toxic environments these days, right? Toxic
Right.
workspaces, controlling environments. I'm trying to understand what is the trauma associated with that space.
A space of kind of where you feel like there's limited control or
Mhm.
that yeah, that there's limited control or there's not much freedom, if you will,
Mhm.
living in that space. I think that's a great question. It's a really important question on so many levels. I think it's more so of how one copes with that.
Mhm.
And I think that's what I'm hearing of more of like for some, how they've been able to kind of cope and navigate their way
Mm.
in that type of
Okay.
environment versus others kind of navigate in a way where maybe a bit more challenges. And not that it's not challenging for the other
Mhm.
person, they just navigate it a bit differently. And you're right, it kind of goes back to those lived experiences and different experiences. And I do think identity has a lot to do with it. And what I mean by that is we talk about the intersectionality of identity.
Mhm.
So let's kind of go back to the examples of matriarchal and patriarchal and kind of specifically like women and their experiences now and kind of feeling like the limited levels of control for certain groups, the intersectionality of race and gender, or
Mm-hmm.
their sexual orientation and race, that intersectionality of that identity will essentially then their lived experiences, one is different, is not that, okay, I am used to not having control, but that experience of not having control and things being out of my control has been, I won't say it's been around longer, but it has, it's been around
Mm.
longer, but the experience of it is more pronounced and more pronounced than another person where they are navigating that gendered experience,
Mm.
but they have, when it comes to race, there's a level of privilege that they may have. And when I mean privilege, accessibility to
Mm.
different things or other resources that the other person may not. And so then there's different layers of that stress and layers of that control. Whereas almost for one group, in order to have a sense of sanity, if you will, or to kind of maintain some sense of mental health, it's been that ability to be able to navigate it, to know that this is what it is and to be socialized around it. That's why we have like parents engage in racial socialization, like this system exists.
Mm-hmm.
We will work to try to dismantle it or deconstruct it, but this system exists.
Right.
And this is, and kind of really giving concrete examples of this is how you need to cope, or how do I exist, essentially almost like these learned coping strategies to deal within this system that doesn't allow you to feel like you have control, or isn't set up for you to have a sense of control, versus another group, because there's this level of accessibility. We can label it privilege, but there's this access
Mm-hmm.
idea that I don't have
Advantage.
a sense of control is baffling, is frustrating, is a lot of things. And not saying that the other group doesn't experience, they do,
Mm-hmm.
to the point where it shows up physically. Because when we begin to look at health disparities, that's where we see those health disparities, because it impacts their health, the physical health, where more heart disease or rates of obesity and things like that. So it is showing up.
Mm-hmm.
It just may be showing up, or recapturing, or we're paying attention to it more from the physical than as it relates to the mental health. Yeah.
It's interesting you said that, because I don't mean to say that we have less trauma at all when I think of matriarchal and patriarchal. What I've observed, for example, in even my friendships, I've come to realize, in my experience, that because we have more trauma, right? If you're black and you're a woman, um, it takes uh, more intentional character building, right, for us to achieve the same level, for example, of even socioeconomic status or even accomplishments, right? So the black women I tend to know are very strong and would have very much worked hard to overcome those things. They know how to set boundaries. They have come to a different place emotionally because they've had to put in the work to be that accomplished, and because we have less access.
Hmm.
With my other friends, like my white friends, it's different, right? You wouldn't have had to struggle all of that much to get there often, because there's an advantage. You have an advantage, right?
Right.
And so the level of setting boundaries you wouldn't have needed, right? Because you do have that advantage, do have that access, you do have those doors that open, that sometimes, are passed on,
Hmm.
right? Because some of the advantages come from having a parent or a sibling who have those advantages and by way have benefited from that.
Hmm.
And so certain things show up differently, right? Because you haven't had to focus on character building elements. You've only had to focus on acquiring money. That's what I've observed and I'm saying this because it's how I've observed in my relationships with people. And so depending on the background of different people, our relationships are different for
Yeah.
that reasons, right? So I draw a lot of strength from, from all of my friends, just different things in different ways. I learn different things. But I say this to say that one of the other traumatic things that I've been finding, and I find myself thinking about more lately, is the trauma of poverty. Growing up poor, for example, it's never something I've talked about because I never considered myself to be, that badly off, right? Because, even if you're poor, like, everybody else around you is poor, and you have, those good relationships that keep you going, and they're fine, and everything is okay. But that what I've been finding now is, if you're thinking about acquiring more or having more, you kind of have to deal with your past. They're thinking about the way we think about poverty. I'm almost starting to see there's a traumatizing effect sometimes that stops us, that makes us, not want to seek more. And I was wondering if you've come across that, whether it's in your research or, in your practices and things like that. Any of those, what have you observed in terms of the traumatic effects of poverty?
That's a very interesting question, and my mind is kind of going a lot of different ways. It's definitely on the last kind of comment that we had in regards to um, the women and their kind of coping, and then this question. So there's a lot of different things in my mind right now, but in this present kind of question, what immediately comes to mind is my experience has been more systemic.
Mm,
So the individual assumption or individual presentation of, like, not necessarily the trauma of poverty, and not necessarily, I won't say not necessarily, you didn't say wanting more, it was I forgot what you said in regards to more, but I see it as systemic. And what I mean by that is, in some of my work with engaging with communities, there was a specific population that I worked with when I was working in Baltimore with the Hope Project, and it was emerging adults, but they call them opportunity youth. So the term in the literature is called opportunity youth, for youth ages 18 to 25 who are what we call disconnected from the workforce and from school systems. So these are folks who've kind of exited school early or prematurely, so they didn't necessarily get a high school diploma, and they're not connected to the workforce. They're not working, so they call them opportunity youth. And so there was a job training center that I had partnered with to work with this opportunity youth, to focus on mental health,
mm-hmm,
psychoeducation around mental health, as they were kind of making their way through the program, and for to essentially get employment and get their GED. And where I'm going with this is that within that community, the community center was considered an empowerment zone. So it was considered a safe zone where there wasn't theoretically violence within that safe zone or empowerment zone, but it may have been violence around that area.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so when I think about, and it was a very, like, economically under-resourced communities or environment. And
mm-hmm,
so a lot of it, when I think about I won't say mentality, but their way of kind of navigating the world was more so in survival mode. And you see that a lot with those in trauma experiences, that you kind of operate in survival mode. And so sometimes we operate off of what we've been exposed to and representation of what we see. And when we have limited opportunities presented, because systematically there's not a lot of opportunities within your environment, within your community, then you kind of, there's a cycle that's almost repeated. And it's that trauma. It may be a trauma cycle, because
mm-hmm,
we tend to either parent from our own hurt and pain, because we parent from what we know, and we kind of pass it down until we do the work to do something different and to kind of break that cycle. So I see that kind of the trauma of poverty, and essentially kind of getting, whether you want to call it stuck, stunted, or within that cycle
mm-hmm,
of poverty, of not necessarily having the exposure or experiences to be able to kind of see opportunities outside of that. But then once we get out of, but what happens when we get outside of that? So, okay, I made it to the university. So now I'm considered upwardly mobile. So I
mm-hmm,
got my degree. I know
mm-hmm,
what my experience has been in regards to being from an under-resourced community, but now I've got my degree, I'm employed, or I'm on my way to having pretty substantial or comfortable salary, or
mm-hmm.
starting your business, and now you have a fairly comfortable, but I still have the mindset of scarcity.
That's the word. Yeah. Okay.
Right, right. And so,
Absolutely.
right. So sometimes we may move out of the scarcity of
Mm,
not having enough, of it not being there, or if I do get it accumulated, then maybe I have to hold on to it as opposed to kind of being having more risk to be able to
mm-hmm.
make more or to kind of move in a very different way,
Yeah.
right?
Wow. It's. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and for some, there's this feeling of guilt.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, of like, let me give back and absolutely give back, but they give back out of a sacrifice of themselves.
Absolutely.
And so therefore, as opposed to upwardly mobile, you kind of going backwards
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing just a bit better than others because there's nothing wrong with kind of reaching back and helping, absolutely. But
Right.
you do it out of this self-sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That's exactly, oh my gosh, you touch on something that I've been thinking about a lot because one of the things I've been observing is institutions in general. And when I say institutions, I'm not talking about just universities, I'm talking about institutions, right? And I see, a corporation, fits into that institution as well, right? That's the institution, law, all of these institutions. I see how much they take advantage of the fact that we exist in that mindset,
Right.
because there's that expectation that we continue to exist in that scarcity,
Mm.
whether it's mentally, emotionally, or even monetarily. Right. There's that mindset. Oh my gosh. It's been becoming so much more visible to me as I make purposeful decisions to climb, because the climbing process has really been eye opening. I don't think I have this perception that people's eyes are not as opened when they're not climbing somewhere, right? Whether it's climbing up or falling down.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I purposely make these goals because every step of the way reveals to me something
Hmm.
about those around me.
Right.
Um, in terms of expectations, it's amazing to see how we're expected to exist and to continue to exist with that mindset. And I think that's very traumatizing, you know?
Right. Right. You said something there of like essentially how I'm going to say blinders. You didn't say that, but blinders on where we're not climbing.
Mm.
I was going to say, well, the blinders that you're describing is sometimes we don't know to look around.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes we just kind of navigate the space that we know, and we don't allow ourselves to kind of navigate experiences or have experiences that we don't know. So we kind of stay with what's familiar and,
Right.
and what we know. And sometimes that can be related to survival mode, um, as
Yeah.
well. So kind of think about that as sometimes as a trauma response, staying in our comfort because we
Mm-hmm.
feel like we have control over that because we know that.
Right.
So staying in that level of comfort.
Right. But also, one of the eye opening things about trying to climb is that you have new key players involved, right? New key players that sometimes you might potentially compete with, right? Or you might potentially become a threat to. And so that gives you a completely different experience, right?
Hmm.
Going with your three E's, which I love, you have new events happening when you try to do that. You have new experiences. And then those are the experiences I find that has opened up my eyes. Like if I didn't aim for anything bigger, it wouldn't matter because I wouldn't be a threat to those, around me, for example.
Hmm.
And so you can remain in that perception.
Right. Right. Yeah. Kind of remaining there. It makes me somewhat go back when you said that there's some kind of that climbing higher and those characteristics of like you having to really, I won't say hone those characteristics, but you really had to build. those characteristics because of one's lived experience, where others they didn't necessarily have to, because kind of like things kind of catered to their existence or to their experience.
Mm-hmm.
What also came to mind was that, and I think it's one and the same in regards to the safety that one had and being able to have that sense of vulnerability to be able. So whereas one group that it wasn't safe to be vulnerable and show that aspect of themselves, so you had to build those certain characteristics or to be socialized. So you had to be essentially racial socialization, socialized in regards to how you may be experienced or not experienced, how the world may treat you or not treat you,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of add to those building blocks, those characteristics you were speaking to.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for another experience, not saying they didn't necessarily have to build, but there was a level, there was space made for
Mm.
them to exist in a very different way and show emotion or vulnerability, or for lack of a better word, to experience their emotions in a very different way than another group. It became a liability if you did, right?
Yeah,
Being able to
absolutely.
then focus on your space made for you to have that experience, and
Right.
therefore you're able to kind of focus on whether it's building financially or whatever.
Yeah. Wow.
So it makes me think of that as well.
Oh my gosh.
So much when we kind of think about these experiences and kind of trauma, and when we're kind of thinking about trauma, and what events are like extremely stress, kind of those very stressful events that we may all experience
Mm-hmm.
versus those events that are like traumatic. And one of the things if nothing else, I definitely want to the take home message to be, when we kind of think about trauma, an experience kind of becoming traumatic when it overwhelms our systems for responding to that stress.
Mm.
So, kind of going back to essentially not every experience that sets off our kind of like our stress response system is going to be traumatic. But if the experience becomes traumatic, essentially when it overwhelms the system that we use to respond to it, and any attempts that we use, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, they're not effective in preventing or managing that threat, and we're left feeling hopeless,
Yeah.
well, helpless and vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
and out of control. And that's when it becomes traumatic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow. And I'm thinking too, from what you said, absolutely lack of access, and can lead to, and not can, do lead to feelings of there's no way out, there's no hope.
Hmm.
And sometimes people can't think of the other options, right? What are the other options? I'm just wondering how you've come across that, because I'm thinking of what has been happening with our kids, the increased suicides, in Black children, for example, has been something that's been in my mind, trying to understand why, even though I haven't started necessarily reading up on those just yet. Why and what would, you know, lead kids down that road, to self harm. I don't know if you've, looked at any of that in your work or anything.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So the increased rates of suicidality in Black youth, and particularly Black males, that rate tends to be higher for Black males. Is higher in Black and Brown youth, has increased. At one point in time, it had increased by, I think, 200%. The number was really high, like the increase in suicidality and suicide attempts, um, for that population. There are a number of there are a number of factors, right? When we kind of think about mental health and kind of our conversations around mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and accessibility to services, providers. In order to kind of think about, okay, I have access to provider, is how do I first begin to identify that this issue I'm having is a mental health issue or concern?
Mm-hmm.
What is the conversation around it? Is it a part of a conversation, or am I quote unquote suffering in silence?
Mm.
right? And so if I'm in having an experience where or feel like I'm in an environment, I perceive that I'm in an environment where I cannot talk about my vulnerability, the anxiety, the depression that's becoming debilitating, and I don't know how to navigate it, and I'm in an environment where I'm just supposed to get over it,
Mm.
then I begin to quote unquote suffer in silence. And so when a young person or any person kind of gets to the point where they are kind of considering that aspect of like suicide, is because from their perception or their experience, that becomes the only option.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
if I take it a couple of steps back and kind of think about those that self harm, my young people clients that I've experienced as self harm, the rationale, the reason for it can range from some people it actually being a release for
Mm.
them. They are so overwhelmed with the emotion that they are experiencing or the level of stress and emotionality that they are experiencing that they feel like the self-harm
Mm-hmm.
is more of a way of to release or feel a sense of release and or kind of like the sense of control. They
Mm-hmm.
feel like they have a level of control in their environment, so they're kind of releasing. Others, it feels as if there's this level of whether it's shame and guilt
Mm-hmm.
that they are inflicting the self-harm almost to as an act of punishment for
Mm-hmm.
themselves,
Yeah.
right?
They deserve that.
Because
They think
yeah,
that.
they don't feel like I won't say they don't deserve the release, but it's almost like they feel like they feel like the pain that they are experiencing in their life, they are essentially feel like they, for lack of a better word, deserve that pain
Mm-hmm.
physically, and so they're kind of inflicting the pain. And so, trying to find a sense of kind of like control in some way, whether it's essentially in a very maladaptive way, but they kind of seeing this increase in numbers is essentially, I think, as we begin to move the conversation around mental health and really begin to pay attention and kind of seeing how we talk about mental health or not talk about mental health with different groups and the levels of stress. I don't know about you, but my college students and even some of my Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, their ability to be able to express their level of stress
Mm-hmm.
and articulate their mental health is very different than millennials and Gen X and baby
Mm-hmm.
boomers. But what I found is that the expression is there, but the coping strategies are not
Mm.
to be able to cope and the ability to be able to access support, physical people support, is not as prevalent or a go-to versus the millennials or Gen X.
Mm-hmm.
And the baby boomers are a bit different because they're more kind of stoic, more, kind of like grin and bear it type of type of approach.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't necessarily healthy, but that was just essentially the norms around around that time. So I'm seeing more of like discussion around mental health, acknowledging mental health, but not necessarily effective coping
Mm-mm.
or even accessing support.
Right.
Posting, like utilizing social media more of like venting or sharing,
Right.
but not necessarily accessing support.
Right. Absolutely.
And that in turn can feel isolated. It can feel like no one cares because you're not necessarily accessing support. You're just letting people know you're sounding the alarm, but you're not accessing support and you're not implementing coping. And we talk a lot about self care,
Mm-hmm.
but there are certain strategies of self care that are helpful under certain circumstances, and there are others that are not.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very true.
Right. So,
Very
yeah,
true.
I may be feeling depressed and down, and I'm having these negative thoughts of harming myself, and going to get my nails done is not going to help. You know what I mean? So
Right.
it's like,
Absolutely.
right,
You know?
right.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a number of things, but that
Mhm.
comes to mind as we're kind of talking now.
Wow. We spend so much time dealing with the symptoms, and that's the issue. You deal with the symptoms, and so uh, our students, and our kids in general are utilizing the resources they have, right? Now they have social media. So yeah, you're expressing it all, but you're not really dealing with it all,
Right.
right? I also think the issue is they don't really know and understand what is it to deal with. And I think partly from what I've observed, I think it comes from a lack of vulnerability
Mm,
on the part of our generation, right?
hmm.
Because we are the older generation.
Right.
And I just I one of the reasons I want to talk we talk about it almost on up here, right?
Hmm.
Almost as if, I guess, intellectually in a way,
Yeah.
not to insult us as intellectuals, but I think that the intellectualism helps us to be informed. But I don't necessarily think that it translates it into something practical, because sometimes intellectualism it's a coping mechanism even for us, right? We talk about it. We can talk about it up here. We can keep it up here. That way, we don't have to put ourselves at risk.
Hmm.
But we're not necessarily identifying, what
Right.
that is and what it is students can look at, right? But yeah, this generation is definitely more expressive. They'll express that
Right.
they have it. I think they're more expressive about this, which is one of the reasons, I thought we already have to go for it and talk about it, because they'll express it more.
Right.
But I don't necessarily think they understand necessarily, what it is. They know that they're having a hard time and struggling. I remember one situation where I could see it's manifested itself where the student shut down, right?
Hmm.
And we came to the end of the semester, and the student needed to graduate.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, I just looked at her and I said, I just gave her the book, The Power of Vulnerability to read. When she read that book, it melted away her defenses completely. And then she just came to me. It literally had the effect that I was hoping for. I just like wish I gave her that book in the beginning of the year, right? I felt like, okay, it was arming her. And she just said, if I wasn't, so busy, whatever it is, I don't even remember what she said, feeling ashamed, feeling, defensive with everything, I would have just done great and been so open to these new suggestions.
Hmm.
She's like, I'm going to share it with everybody in my class. And I mean, I was amazed by the effect, even though that was the effect I was hoping for. But I
Yeah.
think that our generation needs to arm ourselves with the tools to allow these students to be agents and understanding what and the why they're doing what they're doing. I think because there is that disconnect, it makes communication really hard. Right, because even we are afraid of, what is somebody else going to say.
Right.
And I'm just thinking, no, it just means that we're the healthiest people because we're talking about it. You know what I mean?
Right.
As opposed
Right.
to the other person who is really working hard to pair strong, and I'm guilty of that too.
Yeah. I think you created a space for that vulnerability to exist. And I believe that is maybe one of the challenges that that some of us may have in regards to, okay,
Mhm.
I'm open to being vulnerable, but where's the space, the safe space where I can be vulnerable?
Mhm.
Because not all spaces are perceived or considered safe where you can express that vulnerability.
Mhm.
But clearly, you created a space for that student and for other students to feel like they can have that sense of vulnerability and express it, and to be able to do the work to know, okay, yes, I'm vulnerable. Okay, so now, how do I work with that vulnerability, and how do I use it as a strength? Because there is power in vulnerability, and be able to use that.
Yeah. But I also think that that is my struggle.
Mhm.
I think that I know of other people who do so much better, at being vulnerable to the point where students will feel comfortable being with that level of vulnerability. I don't necessarily think that all of it is good, right? That throwing up everything, even like, the book mentioned and Brene Brown mentioned, if you're vomiting it all, you're not being vulnerable. That's just you, you know,
Yeah.
putting everything out there. And that's not vulnerability. But I think it's something I've always struggled with because I also set boundaries. And so you're trying to figure out what's a healthy medium. And I've been thinking more and more about, so what's a healthy medium and how can we help prepare faculty for what's healthy, to be vulnerable about, and what is that vulnerability? Because I think most people feel like, well, why should we have to? It's not, this is academia, this is higher ed. But I think most people don't realize that where they've given access, they're vulnerable without realizing that they are.
Right.
Right?
Right.
They've opened a door emotionally where anybody feels like they're let in. It's where the doors have been open. And
Mm-hmm.
often that emotional door is not open for Black kids, right? They're often seen as the kids people need to save, and not the kids that people can connect with,
Right.
or learn from, which has given me this, I want to say, I don't want to say unique attachment, but I just really appreciate just HBCUs in that space, you
Right.
know, that you do, that it allows you to do that.
Right. Right. And I think you definitely made an important, very important point in regards to really understanding what vulnerability is. And it's not just, I'm going to share everything with the world and share everything that is going on. Um,
Mhm.
in therapy, in the therapeutic process, we call that word vomit
Mhm.
or emotional vomit, like you just letting it all out. But the kind of like the wisdom in the vulnerability is sharing with a purpose
Mhm.
that both are edified or moving the goal along. So it is vulnerability. There's vulnerability and there's also some strategy, being strategic in your vulnerability, right? Of sharing like this, you see this young person who is, really struggling, like, I don't know what I want to do. And I feel like I'm a failure and I don't know what my next step should be. And kind of having that vulnerability to say like, you're not alone. And then whether kind of having that discernment of like, how much do I share and kind of saying, sometimes I don't know either. And that can be really scary and allow
Right.
that space, but yeah, I'm scared. So they can label it of like, yeah, this is what's going on.
Mhm.
So they can move the relationship along and move their goals along. Um, yeah, so I definitely right on spot in regards to what vulnerability is.
Mhm. Wow.
But you said a very powerful thing when it comes to Black youth,
Mhm.
emerging adults and young adults, is that oftentimes they are seen as needing to be saved versus connecting, like really connecting, um, and really seeing their strengths
Mhm.
and being able to be placed in whether it's an environment or position to lead.
Wow.
When I mean lead, I mean just emotionally for the mental health vulnerability, given that space from that perspective.
Wow. You know, um it's one of the reasons I focus on Black representations, in the science curriculum, because I find that all of us, Black or not,
Yeah.
we need to understand what those strengths are.
Right.
And I found that even when I read through, when I started this work and started interviewing, Black folks as well, and realizing, oh my gosh, we have to figure that out too. Even the ones who exhibit and show, that strength or recognize that strength. It's almost as if we're trying to figure out what it is, even though we know it's there and we know what it is. Some people are aware of it, not others are. And for me, the importance of focusing on that work, which I intentionally do, is what our students need to know in a world where we're micromanaged, right? A lot of us were micromanaged what we say, what we think, what we do, what we look like. What we need to understand in adapting to that world is very different from what other students, especially white students who are not micromanaged in the same way, need to know. And so this is all part of this journey, for me. When I wrote that book, I ended it by saying the last chapter is implications for the economic pipeline and mental health, because I found that those were the biggest revealers of where all of our condition, of the condition of the society that we live in, of the mental health of the society that we live in, right? Because, we don't often associate someone who dislikes us with having real mental issues,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a lot of mental issues there.
Yeah.
Wow. So I know we can continue talking about this, which we do have another opportunity to continue talking about this next week. So I am going to let me see if any questions came up from folks. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to really figure out some other solution. Let me see, because I don't think we didn't see. Nope, it never went live. Let me see if anybody added questions to either. Okay, well, it's too bad I wasn't able to do this, but I will post this right away before I edit it, and then edit it down for next week.
Okay.
And I'm going to hope the second one scheduled okay. We'll get another shot at it. I did make some changes to this, hoping I was making it better.
Okay.
But anyway, do you any last minute advice, especially for people who feel traumatized, if they're living amidst a trauma? What advice, do you have for them?
I think that's a great question, and I'm hoping that our next time together, that we can really spend some time on like coping,
Mm,
next steps, kind of moving forward when we are able to identify like trauma and
mm-hmm,
symptoms, and kind of looking from an individual perspective, how do we move forward, and then as a collective kind of community
mm-hmm,
perspective of moving forward. But I would say for today, I kind of like a take home. If you've listened to this and something resonated with you, and you're like identifying, like, wait a minute, maybe this was a trauma experience. I'm experiencing this as trauma.
mm-hmm,
So now I know it. So
mm-hmm,
what do I do with that now? And it's so easy to say, reach out and get help, right? But for some, it's like, okay, how do I navigate that? Particularly, do I have insurance? I don't have
mm,
insurance. Can I pay out of
yeah,
pocket? Like all of those things. But the little thing that you can do is very, very little. And I feel like small changes, and we keep doing them consistently, can lead to kind of big changes.
mm-hmm,
One thing would be just find something that you feel like you have control over, and take and essentially every day or in every situation, find some aspect that you feel like you have control over,
mm-hmm,
and kind of and allow yourself to kind of experience that control and have that level of control. So in the situation that may seem out of your control and may seem helpless, what is one aspect? And that one aspect may be deep breathing and have a sense of relief in that moment. It may be to call someone that you can have as a sense of support, or
mm-hmm,
letting someone know, like, this is how I'm feeling. I'm feeling on edge. I need someone to kind of help talk me off. So I can
mm-hmm,
talk me off of that edge that I'm feeling, right? So kind of allow yourself to be vulnerable, to say, hey, I need some support because I'm not able. So maybe just find that one area where you have control
mm-hmm.
that would be helpful to relieve what you're experiencing.
Right. And control, and you should say, find something good, right? As long as it's good.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. That was my assumption. I should say it, right? I should say that you have control of that's helpful and adaptive, but more so
Right.
helpful, not harmful.
Healthy.
We
Yeah.
want healthy and helpful, not necessarily harm. We don't want harmful.
I think it's also important for students to know and for everybody to know that um, oftentimes we always think we're the only one going through that thing.
Right.
Like I was amazed when I started opening up with my friends about, even my situation with my mom. But all of them said, not all, but so far the couple I've opened up, I was like, oh, my mom has the same thing too, or, my mom has that same condition.
Right.
I was like, oh, wow. And these are people that,
Yeah.
are professionals, people I respect, people that you would never have thought was like, oh. And so other people are going through it too. It's just that we don't talk about it. So people feel alone in the process and feel
Mhm.
like they're the only one. And I'm amazed by every time I choose to be vulnerable that there's a bunch of other people,
Right. Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
know.
Absolutely. One of the things I often say is healing. Definitely feel like healing happens in community.
Mhm.
So kind of finding that
Mm,
community, healthy community.
yeah.
So kind of understanding that you're not alone. There's others that have a similar or shared experience, and having that healthy community that kind of creates the space for you to have healthy ways of adapting, healthy ways of coping.
Yeah. That makes
Absolutely.
sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. This has been great.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for getting this conversation off the ground. And so next week, you want to talk about coping mechanisms. Anything else you could think of that you want to talk about?
I do think coping, building community,
Hmm.
kind of like leading with this healing and community and kind of finding those spaces.
Okay.
And if there's any questions that kind of come in, we can, yeah, definitely around trauma and really understanding it and all the different ways that it can show up.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank
Thank you.
you. And just want to say if you all enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And hopefully soon we'll consistently get this live thing going well on YouTube. I don't know what's happening, but thank you
Right.
all.
Thank you.